We'll get to it. Okay, folks, time to get started. Reminder again that if you want to turn in your discounted cash flow valuation for feedback, it's April 4th, which is a little while from now, but there's a spring break right in the middle. So if you're going to do some work, it probably has to be before spring break. But today I want to continue our discussion of stories and numbers. I remember when I wrote my book, Narrative and Numbers, about connecting to stories numbers, I got a lot of pushback from numbers-oriented analysts. And they said, we don't tell stories, we work with numbers. And I said, really? You work with numbers, you don't think you're telling a story? So here's what I'd like you to do. I'm going to show you a discounted cash flow valuation, which is all numbers, and I want you to reverse engineer the story I'm telling from the numbers. So here's what I have in my spreadsheet. I have a 50% compounded annual growth rate in revenues for the next 10 years. File that away, compounded annual growth rate, 50% a year. Second, I'm assuming that this company, by the time it gets to year 10, will have a 20% operating margin, which is twice the average for the industry group it's in. Third, this company has a very low reinvestment for the next 10 years. I'm using a high sales to capital ratio. And finally, I'm giving this company a cost to capital of 7% in dollar terms, lower than the average cost to capital. Okay, so that's all you have, a spreadsheet. I'm just going to ask you to guess what the underlying story is. First, am I valuing a small company or a large company, you think, based on those numbers? And what's the clue that it's a small company? 50% compounded annual growth rate means you're taking your company and increasing it 100-fold. That's what 50% growth over the next 10 years is. If you have 20 billion in revenues right now, 50 times 20 is $1 trillion in revenue. So clearly, it's got to be a small company. Is the total market that it's going after growing or stable? Because if it were stable, how do you get 50% compounded growth? You got to eat market share away. And what's the clue that that's not what they're doing? What's their margin doing? It's twice as high. So if you're going after market share, you're probably competing on price. If you're competing on price, so the fact that you have 50% compounded growth rate and 20% margin suggests that the market must be growing. Third, are you telling me a story about the competitive advantages that this company has? Somewhere in there, Sophia? The margins are much higher. There's something they're doing that allows them to charge higher margins. Maybe a strong brand name. Maybe a patent. What about capital intensity? Yeah. Low, and what is it that gives it away? The reinvestment is low, so the capital intensity is low. And finally, let's crown the whole story. Is this company selling a product that is discretionary or non-discretionary? And what is the clue you would look at to answer that? It's non-discretionary, and what is the clue that gives that away? 7% cost of capital. Remember when you talked about betas, we said if you have a non-discretionary product. So basically, you're telling me a story of a small company that's going to grow explosively in a market that's big and growing, while having strong competitive advantages with low capital intensity and a non-discretionary product. So when you show me that spreadsheet, I'm going to read the story back to you and say, hey, do you buy that story? If you say, I don't like that story, you're disagreeing with yourself. Try this out. The next time you pick up an Excel spreadsheet, reverse engineer from it, because you cannot get away from telling a story. You can either leave it implicit, which is what a lot of analysts do, or make it explicit. So I'm going to pick on a couple of you who pick companies to value. And Brian, you're valuing PDD, right? So let's go through it part by part. If you are telling a story for PDD in terms of revenue growth, are you telling what kind of story? Big, high growth, low growth, average growth? Back it up. High growth, and what's the basis for that story? Okay. The only problem is the US is a mature market, so you're going after market share. So I would push you on that story and say, what are they doing in the US that allows them to get that growth rate? Maybe they're offering something that US consumers don't have right now. So PDD, our argument is it's a big story because it's a company in a market which has moderate growth. China's growth is moderated, but it has the capacity to go global. Right? What about margins? What's its business? How does it make money? Are they selling or they intermediate? Alibaba is an intermediary, right? You just connect customers to stores and they keep a percentage. PDD is similar in terms of how it makes money. It's a transaction every time there's a which is a high margin business because you basically are an intermediary. You connect, customers. So your growth, you got your margins. We can finish your valuation right now. To grow, what does PDD have to do? Remember, you've told 2/3 of your story already, right? You talked about growing where? In other markets. So the reinvestment here will either have to take acquisitions in other markets to get an entry there or some kind of investment platform, customer acquisition costs. Depending on the part of the world, that could be different from their reinvestment in China. And finally, on a cost to capital basis, this is ultimately a business that's built around whether the economy is doing well, how much retail sales there are. It is going to be a discretionary business in that sense. It doesn't mean the revenues are going to drop off the cliff. You have a story for PDD that's going to translate to numbers, and you're going to value the company. Anybody else want to volunteer their company? We'll tell you a story right now. What's the company value? Now we're in trouble. So there's a Polish mail service company. So they're like U.S. mail for Poland. That was it privatized? That's an unusual company to value. What led you to that? Okay. So they sell. But are they primarily? So let's start with the story. Are they only Poland based? Okay. So they are looking, so your growth story will include the fact that they're in Poland right now, but that they can take this concept to, is there any competition for this kind of thing in the UK with the places they're going? Okay, so that'll set, okay, so they have this niche market to themselves. They're going to expand geographically. Now, how do they make money? You pay per box or how does it work in terms of how they make money? Okay, so so it's driven by what the merchants are willing to pay them. So we're building to a story, and in the riskier in that story, of course, is that there's going to be some kind of a technological disruption that leads people to pick something else to use. But it's a base story, it's a core story. It's not going to be a soaring growth story because it will require reinvestment, right? You got to build these, so it will require more reinvestment than PDD will. So it's a story that those pieces will play out in your revenue growth, your margins, your sales to capital ratio. And ultimately, the more ambitious you get, the more negative your cash flows will become. Right? So I want you to think about your company. Start thinking about the story before you open the Excel spreadsheet. Don't do the Excel spreadsheet first and then reverse engineer a story because you're missing the point. Okay? You want to think about the story that drives your company. So let's say you've told a story for your company. Are you done? Still 3 weeks away from April 4th. Can things happen in 3 weeks? You've lived through the last 2 weeks, right? The next 3 weeks, who knows what tomorrow will bring and the day after. So let's say what might cause your story to change. Could your story change because your company comes out with an earnings report? Can an earnings report change your story? Give me an example. What kind of news in an earnings report will change your story? See, fantastic or terrible doesn't tell me much, right? That often is. You have to show me there's something happening in your business that I did not expect. Maybe you're entering into geography. So if I take in post and I say, they're expanding in the US, that's what the earnings report. They might not make much money, and all of a sudden my story gets very different because I've added a geography that's a really big geography to their market with a it might not increase the value, but it changes. So in earnings reports, you're not looking at that earnings per share number as much as what goes into it. Where are they growing? Where are they failing? What happens to their margins? An earnings report can change your story, more so if you're a young company than if you're a mature company. Second, could a macroeconomic change affect? You saw the inflation news this morning, right? Came in slightly lower than expected. You're saying, who cares? There are some companies that are extremely exposed to inflation. So when you get the inflation news, it's a macro news, it can affect their valuations as well. You're a Canadian lumber company. The last 2 weeks have been a rollicking ride, right? Not because of anything that happened in the company, but because you have tariffs and talks of counter tariffs, and you're saying, what the heck do we do? Macroeconomic changes can affect. What about regulatory changes? Especially for a subset of companies that are very, very dependent on regulation, a change in the regulation can affect your value. Could an earnings report from another company affect your value? When Lyft reports earnings, could Uber's story be affected? Yeah, because they're related in the same business. If something is affecting one company, it can spill over another company. So you see the bad news here, right? You told a story today. Who knows what that story will look like 3 weeks from now? Because things can change. Your story is going to constantly shift. Now, you might think that's unsettling. I'd like my story to settle down. But to me, this is what makes valuation interesting. You're never quite done. The story keeps evolving. One final question. Remember the corporate life cycle I talked about? Young companies, middle-aged companies, old companies. Valuations are always a balance between stories and numbers. But I want you to think about how that balance changes as you go through. Stripe is going, is a payment processing, young company, and valuing Stripe. You can look at the financials, but much of your value is going to be driven by a story. InPost is still young. Much of your value is going to be driven by the story you tell. In contrast, if you're valuing Coca-Cola, what's going to matter more? Numbers or story? The numbers are basically going to drive your value because the story, the way I like to think about this is somebody's writing a book and they die and they've called you in to finish the book. I know, morbid thought, but the author was in chapter 1 when he died. It's a 35 chapter book. You can write the story you want, right? That's a young company. In contrast, if you're Coca-Cola, you're in chapter 23 of a 35 chapter book. The characters are already wandering around. You can't introduce new things to do. The story has been pretty much told. If you're Kraft Heinz, you're in chapter 34 of a 35 chapter book. You're writing the ending. When you look at mature companies, much of the story is already, doesn't mean the story can't change, but it's not going to change as dramatically as when you look at a young company. So the reason I think for a long time analysts were able to get away without telling stories is for a long time in public companies, the typical company valued was a company with an established business model, a mature company. So you could get away without being a storyteller. Today, you look at companies like Palantir, it's not an option. You have to learn to tell stories. So I'm going to go back to where I left you on the storytelling. If you remember, I was talking about impossible, implausible, and improbable valuations. Remember the Uber story I told you? Urban car service company attracts new users, local networking benefits, doesn't own the cars, keeps 20% of the fare. That's a 2014 story. Is it possible? Yeah. It's not a big uplifting story. I'm telling a story what they're already doing, right? They're already an urban car service company. The part of the world where they've been in the longest, the Bay Area, the car service business had already doubled in the 5 years they'd been there. Why did it double so much? Because people stopped buying cars, because Ubers and Lyfts were so easy to find. And they were getting 20% of the fares and not owning the cars. So this story is very easy to defend because it is a story where I've not gotten ambitious. Could I have told a different story in 2014 for Uber? Yeah, I could have told you a much bigger story. But if I did that, the onus is on me to try to explain why the bigger my story gets, the more defense I should be playing, because I have to justify all these parts of the story. So stories lead to numbers, numbers lead to value, right? So let's say you're an investor. I'm going to give you a warning about a story you might run into. I call it a runaway story. What's a runaway story? A story that sounds so good, you want it to be true. Here are the ingredients that usually go into a runaway story. Usually there's a charismatic storyteller, somebody you really like or admire. Second, they're telling a story about disrupting a business you've never ever liked. And third, along the way, they're going to make the world a better place. Come on, don't you want the story to be true? I'll tell you a story. You tell me whether you want this story to be true. It's about a 19-year-old who drops out of Stanford. Who does that? You know how difficult it is to get in there? What is the admission rate was about -3%? Unless you're, of course, a rhythmic gymnast who came in through the side door, but that's a different story. Who drops out? So this 19-year-old drops out of Stanford to start a new business. His reaction is another tech geek starting another software business. This is where the story takes a turn. This 19-year-old is not a tech geek or a male, it's a female. She drops out and she starts a blood testing business. And she's going to revolutionize this business. How many of you had experiences with the blood testing business in the US anytime in the last few years? The experience is happy, exuberant. How would you describe this experience? Not too fun. That's exactly the word I would use. You call and you set up an appointment for a blood test. And they say, well, it's 6 a.m. 4 weeks from now. Is there something at a more reasonable time? Well, we have an opening 2 years from now. Okay, I'll take the 6 a.m. 4 weeks from now. You show up at 6 a.m., they make you wait for 2 hours. Why? Because they can. 8 a.m., the doors open and a nurse comes out of the room. She looks like Nurse Ratched from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. She said, come on in. Your knees start knocking, terrified. You walk in. You notice 2 buckets next to her. What are those for? Your blood. Why do you need 2 buckets of my blood? Just in case Dracula shows up, I guess. She extracts half your blood and they make you drag yourself out of the room. You drive home and you hear nothing from the blood testing company. So 2 weeks later, you call them and say, I want the results of my test. Say, we can't give you the results. Why not? Privacy. It's my blood. We'll send your results to the doctor. You can go talk to him or her. So you call the doctor. 6 a.m. 4 weeks from now. This game you already played. So you say, okay. Show up 6 a.m. They make you wait 2 hours. You walk into the doctor's office. He's looking at your blood test, looking very troubled. So after about 10 minutes of letting you kind of worry, he says, there's nothing wrong with you. So why did you say that right off the top? Because I wanted to torture you. So you take the results home. But no, the story is not over, because 4 weeks later, what do you get? You get a bill in the mail for $1,500 that the insurance company wouldn't cover. No wonder we hate the blood testing business. And what's she going to do? She's going to revolutionize the business. Instead of 2 buckets, she's going to take 2 drops of your blood in nanotainers, not buckets. Sounds already 21st century, right?
She's going to test the blood for 32 different things. I don't even name some of them, but they're very technical names.
45 minutes later, she's going to email you the results. And the whole thing is going to cost you $100. Come on. And oh, I forgot to say this. She's also going to give these blood tests away free to parts of the world people can't afford the blood test, and you're going to save tens of millions of people in the process. Don't you want the story to be true? I did. This is, of course, the true story of Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos. She drops out of Stanford, starts a company. By the middle of 2015, Theranos was priced by venture capitalists at $9 billion. But it wasn't just VCs who got excited. The Cleveland Clinic, one of America's leading healthcare organizations, said, this is a great blood testing business. Walgreens, which at that time was a healthy pharmacy, said, we're going to have a Theranos lab in every Walgreens. So if you'd asked me in the middle of 2015 what I thought about Theranos, my response would have been, I don't know much about the company, $9 billion pricing, Walgreens, Cleveland Clinic, there must be something there. I assume that somebody somewhere along the way would have asked the question, which is, it's a blood testing company, right? Does your blood test work? And in October of 2015, a Wall Street Journal reporter asked exactly this question. And the results were actually in the public domain because as a blood testing company, you got to go to the FDA, you got to file your results. He went to the FDA and said, hey, Theranos claims to run these 32 tests from their nanotainers. How many of those tests have they been approved to do? The FDA said, we've approved them for one, but not the other 31. And he said, why? He said, the results are a little noisy. You know what a noisy blood test looks like? Trust me, you don't want it. The result comes back and says, you might be dying, you might not, don't worry about it, go home and we'll let you know. Okay? Blood tests, you want precision, you don't want noisiness. And in the next 6 months, the entire company unraveled. 6 months later, the pricing had gone to zero. Elizabeth Holmes had been banned from the blood testing business for 3 years. There was a criminal case working its way through that finally got resolved last year when she was sent to jail, I think, for 10 years. But in October of 2015, when this happened, I wrote a post because everybody said, that's stupid. Why would somebody ask that question? I said, let's roll the tape back and go back to June of 2015 when Elizabeth Holmes came to New York to give a talk. She was a celebrity. Why? Because she was under 30, she'd become a billionaire, started her own business. People had brought their daughters so they could see success play out. I said, if you'd been in that meeting where Elizabeth Holmes was the celebrity speaker, would you have had the courage to get up and ask the question, does your blood test work? You'd have felt like the guy who shot Bambi's mother. I've always felt badly for that guy. Have you ever seen Bambi? Go back and watch the movie. It's the first 10 minutes. Bambi's mother gets shot by a hunter. The hunter you never see. He's just background. But he must have gone through all kinds of trauma after that movie. You'd have felt you were killing 6-year-old dreams asking that question. There's an intimidation factor when everybody around you is convinced that this is the greatest thing ever. There's an intimidation factor in asking common sense questions. Runaway stories are more common than you think. I remember in 2019, a company called WeWork filed for an IPO. Somebody described to me what the WeWork business model is. What do they do?
Rent that on a space.
Before you rent it out, first you got to get the space, right? How do they get the space? They either buy it or they sign a long-term lease. So you sign a 40-year lease. And where are the sites usually located? The most expensive parts of the city. You look at WeWork buildings, they're in prime real estate. So you've signed expensive real estate for 40 years. Then what do you do?
And reach out to a bunch of people who don't have offices for their businesses.
Okay.
Ask them.
You're doing a service, right? If you're a small business, you don't want to rent an office for the next 10 years. You want to rent for the next 3 months. It's great for young startups. So you basically lease for 40 years and sublease out for 2 months, 3 months, 4 months. Do you see a problem in this model? It's a duration mismatch made in hell, right? And it's never worked in real estate. Because you know what brings it down? A recession. The minute you have a recession, what happens? All your short-term leases leave, your building empties out, and you're still stuck with
40 years of lease payments. So when WeWork went public, I was curious. I was initially going to give them the benefit of the doubt. Why? What is it about WeWork that gave them instant credibility?
Newman is the TEDx speaker, right? By himself, I'd have said another TEDx speaker. Who is the biggest investor in WeWork? A guy called Masa Son, who was viewed as a visionary, perhaps almost at the level of a god, but maybe not very close to it. He had a 300-year plan. You know who makes 300-year plans? Arrogant people who think they have a god complex. But he was viewed in 2019 as a genius investor. So people said, if he is backing it, he must have asked Adam Newman, the CEO of the company, the question of, how do you make this work? So when they filed for an IPO, I went through their prospectus, 411 pages on the prospectus. You know what I was looking for? That secret formula they were using to fix this duration mismatch. I get to page 411, no mention of it. I valued the company afterwards and I said, look, I don't care who the great investors are. This is a duration mismatch made in hell. I don't see a way of fixing it. And I heard from somebody in WeWork saying, but we do this on hundreds of buildings. What happens to a bad model when you multiply it 1,000-fold? It becomes a really big bad model, right? It doesn't become a good model. And of course, in the case of WeWork, the whole thing spun down to zero very, very quickly, partly because of their arrogance. But my point about runaway stories is sometimes people pile on. Nobody wants to stop and ask the question. Remember the story of the emperor's new clothes? You haven't heard the story? This emperor has no clothes, but he tells the townspeople that the only people who can see his clothes are really smart people. What a great ploy. Actually, the tailor tells him to tell the crowd. So even the emperor thinks he's wearing clothes because he looks at it, it doesn't look like I'm wearing clothes. And the tailor says, if you're really brilliant, you can see your clothes. The emperor looks and says, I see all my clothes now. So for weeks, all the townspeople convince themselves, emperor's wearing clothes, emperor's wearing, because if they turn to their neighbor and say, I don't see the clothes, that'd be an admission, I'm not really smart. So who gives away the game? A 5-year-old kid who says, the emperor's naked. Hey, we need that happening more, right? Because these companies, often it's somebody who's naive who says, I don't get this. KKR and Blackstone might think this is an amazing idea, but this just doesn't make sense. One final point, when I wrote my post on Theranos, I did look at the board of directors. They were a private company, but they had a board of directors. I said, how did they get along? And I looked at the names, and before I looked at the names, I looked at the last column. And I said, this is an amazing ploy if you're a CEO who doesn't ever want to be asked a question. You know what you should do? Pick a bunch of 70 or 80-year-olds, make them directors in your company, call them for a board meeting, but put pillows in front of every chair, have an ambulance as backup. Your board meetings will go really quickly, unless you have a casualty. And then you look at names on the board. What the heck is Henry Kissinger doing on the board of directors for a blood testing company? Guy's 92 years old. Maybe he's talking about the Iron Curtain and getting blood out of the Iron Curtain. This is clearly a board that is connected. You see that? That's basically what this is. You have George Shultz on there, ex-Secretary of State. You had, I think it was James Mattis, who was the Secretary of Defense between 2016 and 2018. Connections to governments, to defense contractors. Weird board for a blood testing company, but it's very connected. So watch out for runaway stories, because some of you might have a company where you really, really, really want the story to be true. At which point you stop asking yourself questions, it kind of sails through. So when you think about what causes runaway stories to melt down, first, that charismatic storyteller you discover has feet of clay. They do something and you say, well, I don't try. You know what gave Adam Newman away? He's the CEO of WeWork. Is when you looked at the prospectus, they actually had a clause there that was so unbelievable that I had to read it 3 times to make sure I read it right. If you're a publicly traded company and you have a CEO,
Who replaces the CEO of a publicly traded company if they're incapacitated, they have a stroke, or they die? Who usually does that in a publicly traded company? It's usually the board of directors, right? They come up with suggestions. That's a typical. In the case of WeWork, you know what the clause in the prospectus said would happen if Adam Newman got incapacitated? His wife, Rebecca Newman, would pick the next CEO. What is this, a royal family? That shows a level of arrogance, though, right? Where that people would not even push back. I've never read a more arrogant prospectus than the one put out by WeWork. They were so convinced that they were above the fray, that nobody would ask them questions, that they just exposed themselves. And afterwards, you saw stories about how he banned shoes. Do you know that in WeWork headquarters, Adam Newman demanded that people not wear shoes? God help you if you have athlete's foot. So he put in these and you read about it, say, well, maybe this guy is not the great storyteller that I thought it was. Second, the story is at war with the numbers. So when they tell you we can do this, the story doesn't match up to the numbers you're seeing for the company. And third, your basic business model is a bad model. Expanding it just makes it an even worse model. In the last decade, more and more companies with those ingredients were able to go public. And eventually they crash and burn. But during the period when they're regarded as great companies, you can have tens of billions of dollars of value. This is a side story here about what happens when you find a really big market. Call it the big market delusion. Let's suppose that a big market opens up. Like what? China in its early days, AI now, .com in the 1990s. It's a big market, right? It's beckoning, saying, come on in. You're an entrepreneur. You see this big market. You want to start a business. I want to step back here and ask you a question. If you know entrepreneurs, you've hung out with them, do they tend to be overconfident people or diffident people? You're an entrepreneur. What makes you an entrepreneur? You think you can pull off this flush and you can pull it off. You generally tend to be an overconfident person, which is not bad, right? We need overconfident people. So you start a business going after this big market. Where do you get your money? From venture capitalists. Venture capitalists, they tend to be overconfident people or diffident people. Extraordinarily overconfident because they think they can pick the winner. So now you have an overconfident entrepreneur surrounded by 3 overconfident venture capitalists looking at a really big market. How does this play out? When I ask you, what can your company do, and you project out your revenues and margins, you give me these really big numbers because you're convinced you're going to be the winner. But this is a big market, right? There are 100 clusters just like yours all over the world. They're all aiming for the same big market. They're all overconfident people, overestimate. Do you see where this is going, right? If I add up the values that each of these clusters attaches to itself, what's going to be true about the sum of the values? It's going to be too high. I call this the big market delusion, and it happens every single time. I saw it in the 1980s with the PC business, in the 1990s with the .com business. Social media and online advertising, same phenomenon played out. In fact, when online advertising was taking off, I took the big online advertising companies, I took their market cap and reverse engineered what their revenues would have to be 10 years out to justify the market cap, and I added up the numbers. And I got a total market that was 50% larger than the actual existing market. You think this is crazy. This is irrational. No, it's absolutely human. Every time you have a big market, you will overvalue the market. There will eventually be a correction. And when that happens, what do we call it? The .com, we called it the .com crash. And then we all wring our hands and say, never again. And then regulators say, we want to stop this from happening. Let's pass rules. It is part of markets. You don't like the chaos, then don't go looking for markets. Would you want to live in a world run by actuaries? You know where we'd still be? In caves. This fire thing, this is not tested yet. A few thousand more years, then we'll get out of the cave. Every advance in humankind has come from people overreaching, right? So before we complain about, there will be an AI crash. There will be people who complain about it. But remember the dot-com crash? Did it change, that dot-com boom and crash change the way we live? Let me put it differently. When was the last time any of you actually walked into a physical travel agency? There used to be these places like, big offices where 7 or 8 people sat in front of computers. You'd go in and say, I want to go to Chicago.
They say, okay, let me look at the secret sauce. They wouldn't let you look at their terminal. I found the perfect flight for you. It'll cost you $420, but you got to book it through us right now. I hope none of you are doing that anymore, right? You go to Travelocity, you go to Expedia, you go on Google Flights. Every one of these crashes has changed the way we live. There will be an AI crash because we will overreach, but it'll still change the way we do things. ChatGPT might be doing things for us that we don't do today. So I call this the big market delusion because every time you see a market, right now it's AI, 10 years from now, I don't know what it'll be. But even in the 40 years I played it, I've seen 4 big markets roll through, and every single time this happens. One final example before we leave this phase of storytelling. Is it possible? Is it plausible? Is it probable, right? So Tesla is a company I valued every year. I think the first time I valued was in 2013. For the first 6 years that I valued, I consistently found it overvalued. And I missed some ingredients that later came into play with Tesla. So this is in very early valuation, 2014. I'd done a valuation of Tesla on my blog. I remember I came up with a value of 100 billion, which was high by by the standards of the day, given how few cars were selling. But Tesla has had this fortune or misfortune of being followed by equity research analysts who are true believers. In what? In Tesla. So they're not equity research analysts, they're advocates for Tesla. So this was one of the biggest names in equity research following Tesla. He's still around. I won't name him because I might shame him. So he'd put out a valuation, and his value was 3 times higher than mine. And I was curious about what he was assuming about Tesla that I was missing. So I read his equity research report. First, it's 150 pages long. It's a creative novel there. Lots of pictures. I don't know even of what. And then on page 73, there was a D.C.F. That's what he called it, so I'm going to stay with this terminology. He said, this is our D.C.F. I said, okay, this is the place I live. Let me take a look at the numbers. So I took a look at the numbers. This is his D.C.F. I'm going to go through, remember the exercise we went through this morning? First, I start with the revenue number, and he's projecting lots of growth. In fact, he estimates that the number of cars Tesla will sell will go from 24,000, which is what they'd sold in the previous 12 months, to 1.1 million. First, is that possible? Right? How big is the car market? How many cars get sold in a typical year across the world? It's an unfair question. How the heck would anybody know? We probably should be checking Google search right now. It's about 80 to 85 million cars get sold a year. So 1 million is entirely plausible. So I said, okay. That was actually pretty close to what I was estimating. So I'm a little puzzled because he's estimating roughly the same number of cars, but he's getting a value 3 times higher. So maybe he's assuming technology company margins on cars. You can get there, right? 35, 40 software company. No, his margins were actually a little lower than mine. He had an EBITDA margin, not an EBIT margin. It's actually, so now I'm befuddled. He's selling as many cars as I thought Tesla would, and his margins are a little lower. His value is 3 times higher. And then I looked at his reinvestment. He's saying, how do you get reinvestment? See this earnings number? He called it net income, but it's like an after-tax operating income. And the free cash flow number? What's the difference between what accounts for EBIT times 1 minus T minus free cash flow? What's the intermediate steps? Plus depreciation minus, it's the reinvestment number, right? So I added up his earnings numbers for the next 15 years and his free cash flow numbers for the next 15 years and looked at the difference. That's a collective reinvestment. You know what the collective reinvestment of the next 15 years was? Close to 0. Houston, we have a problem. The number of cars is going to go from 24,000 to 1.1 million. In 2013, Tesla had 1 factory in Fremont, which on a really good day had a capacity of 250,000 cars. You see what the problem is? Where are the other 800,000 cars going to come from? So I called the equity research analyst. He was in Newark Airport catching a flight to California. I think he was going to worship at a Tesla shrine. I don't know what he was going to do. And I said, I'd like to talk about your equity research report. And he said, I can't answer very many questions because, those numbers, no, there's a team that works. I said, there's a team that turned out this D.C.F. I wanted to make sure he used the same terminology, wouldn't get confused. He said, yeah, a team of 6. I said, okay. Can I call you next week? He said, you can call me next week. I'll be back with the team. And I said, okay, I'll call you. And he said, you're not going to write about this on your blog or anything, right? I said, not for the next week, but then all bets are off. So I call him the next week. The team had gathered together. So the lead analyst comes on and he says, look, I'm the lead analyst, but I don't really work with the numbers. I said, what do? He described what he did and basically schmoozed a lot. You know what schmooze is? The very New York word. You just go chat with people, talk with people. He schmoozed with the management, schmooze. He was a chief schmoozer. So his second in command comes in and says, what do? He says, I go with that guy. I'm the secondary schmoozer. There's a third guy, what do? I'm the backup schmoozer. One of these 2 guys can't schmooze. I'm the one who steps in. I said, who in this team does something other than schmooze? They pointed to a 23-year-old analyst they'd hired out of Wharton the previous year. I said, he is the guy. I feel sorry for him. He's on the spot. He's responsible for this D.C.F. We go through and he gets it very quickly. I said, you realize there's a problem here, right? There's capacity of 250,000. You're selling 1.1 million cars. You haven't set aside any reinvestment to build assembly plants. He said, it slipped my mind. I said, what slipped your mind? He said, the way I got the capex and depreciation for future years was I took the numbers from the last year where there wasn't much, didn't build a factory, and I just projected it out. He said, don't you think this is a problem? He said, yes, but I don't see how we go public with this. How do we tell the world we forgot to put in assembly plants? I didn't have an easy answer for him, but I did have a suggestion which he did not take. He said, have you ever seen this movie, Willy Wonka's Chocolate Factory? He said, no, but one of the older analysts had with Gene Wilder. And I said, you might want to rewatch that movie because I remember watching that movie when I was much, much younger. And a big question, that movie, Willy Wonka has one chocolate factory. It's a very inefficiently laid out factory. It's like chocolate rivers riding through. And my big question coming out of that movie is, Willy Wonka chocolates are all over the world. How the heck does this one factory produce enough chocolates to ship out to the rest of the world? And the answer is actually in the movie. There are these creatures called Oompa Loompas. If you get a chance, type in the word Oompa Loompa in Google. They're these, tiny, they just dance around. And as they dance around, candy comes flying out of the factory. I said, here's what you need to do. Put out a news release that Tesla has fired all of its existing workers in the Fremont plant and replaced them with Oompa Loompas. Your problem has gone away. I call these Oompa Loompa valuations, so you can call them whatever. These are valuations. We have these great plans for growth, but nothing is being built to deliver that growth. So impossible, implausible, improbable. Don't take anybody's valuation at face value, including mine. Your job is to be skeptical, to ask those questions, to make sure this valuation passes that test. So now I'm ready to convert my Uber story into numbers. The advantage of my framework is it's parsimonious. There are only 3 things that drive cash flows: revenue growth, margins, reinvestment, or sales to capital. There are only 2 things that capture risk: your cost to capital and a failure risk. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take each part of my Uber story and make it into a number. How did I describe Uber? Urban car service company, right? So the first step was actually coming up with a size for that market. How big? Where would I get this information? I'll tell you, in 2014, nowhere. Why? Because this business in 2014 was hopelessly splintered. Who dominated this business around the world? Taxi cab companies. They were not publicly traded. You know what I had to do? I had to go city by city. New York City has a taxi and limousine commission. They actually track how much taxi cabs make. I had to go city by city. And after about 50 cities, I got tired. I was at 50 billion, so I doubled the number. And I made that the market size to show you why you should never trust Google. So I put that out there with my valuation. 6 months later, I go on Google and say, maybe there's a better number out there. Size of the urban car service market on Google search. Guess what shows up as number one find? Deodorant's 100 bit. If only you knew what I did and how I got there, you wouldn't be using this number. But I had to start. And basically, that's the best I could do. Life gets easier when you're doing the retail business, right? Why? Because many of them are publicly traded. You can add up the revenues of publicly traded retail companies into the public domain. If you have a business that's entirely privately structured, it gets much messier. There'll be numbers you will find on Google search. I don't know how much you can trust them. But this was my starting point. That market had been growing at about 2% a year. It was a slow growth market over the previous 5 years. But in my story, what do I assume? That Uber will attract people like my son and my niece into a business who would never have taken a taxi cab. So I made the 2% growth into 6% growth. So that's the total market. Now I've got to give Uber a market share of that market, right? Do you remember the third part of my story? Local networking benefits. That Uber would end up dominating a city, but there'd be other ride-sharing companies that dominate other cities. In my story, no company, no ride-sharing company is going to have a 50% market share of the global market. So I gave them a 10% market share. Huge by car service standards, but not dominant. Let's keep going on. I have my revenues. I need margins. What does Uber do? It's got a computer. It connects cars to customers. This is a high margin business. You should be able to get amazing unit economics on that 20% that you collect. So I gave them margins of 40%, reflecting their intermediation model. And finally, when I looked at risk, before I go to risk, for the reinvestment, since they don't own the cars, they should be able to grow with relatively little reinvestment. Platforms, maybe computers. So I gave them a sales to capital ratio of 5, which is twice the average for US companies, saying, hey, this is a low capital intensity company. It can grow with very little reinvestment. Almost every part of my story is now an input. Then I got to the cost of capital. So how many sessions did we spend on cost of capital? We started with that dance on risk-free rate, equity risk premium, bottom-up beta. Don't forget any of that stuff. But when you're valuing a company like Uber, that is not the hill you want to die on. Is Uber a risky company in 2014? Absolutely. So here's what I did to get a cost of capital. I have a histogram of cost of capital for all global companies. I went to the 90th percentile. The cost of capital was 11.97%, and I rounded it to 12% and made that my cost of capital. Took me 2 minutes. But let's face it, the big focus here has to be on revenues and market share, not on the cost of capital. One final question. Could Uber have failed given the numbers in 2014? They're a small company losing a lot of money. Venture capitalists don't provide the capital, they wouldn't. So I gave them a 10% failure rate. Why so low? Because in a sense, they're too big to fail. What is too big to fail now? If you're a venture capital, you invest in a $17 billion company, you'll be more reluctant to let that $17 billion company crash and burn than a $17 million company. Because if it crashes and burns, what do you have to do? You have to write off that investment in your portfolio. You have to tell your investors that you lost a lot of money. So in a strange way, being this big makes that failure risk lower. I've taken every single number here and connected the story. Here's my value of Uber. It looks like an Excel spreadsheet, but every number in the sheet comes from my story. So if you ask me why are my revenues 3.6 billion in year 10, it's because Uber is an urban car service company with local networking benefits. Why are my margins 40%? Because an intermediation company that makes money by connecting cars to customers. Why is the reinvestment so low? Because they don't own the cars. Why is my cost of capital so high? Because they're a risky company. Every number has a story backing it. And based on my numbers, the value that I got for Uber was about 6 billion. I posted this. The Wall Street Journal story came out on June 4th of 2014. I spent that entire week obsessing about Uber. Friday, June 8th, at about 3:15, I post this on my blog. 15 minutes later, I get a call from a Wall Street Journal reporter. She must have been waiting at her desk for this to come through. She said, I noticed you valued Uber. I said, thank you for noticing. She said, I also noticed you attached a value of 6 billion. I said, you're very observant. She said, you do know that venture capitalists have valued the company at 17 billion. I almost corrected her there. With what? That venture capitalists price companies, they don't value them, but I cut her some slack. She's a journalist. I said, okay, yeah. She said, how do you explain the 17 billion? I said, I don't have to, I didn't pay it. I've never felt the urge to explain what other people pay. You know how much frustration this has saved me in my life? She said, how do you explain the 95,000 that people are paying for Bitcoin? Go ask somebody who paid the 95,000. Why are you asking me? She said, are you telling me they're wrong? I said, I'm telling you nothing of the sort. Maybe they have a bigger story for Uber than I do. Why don't you ask them? I don't own the high ground here. I have a story. That story gives me a number. The number gives me a value. The value drives my decision. But I'm not going to convince you that my number is, what do I care? It's your money, right? I'll give you my story. You can make it yours. You can change the things that you don't like. But essentially, I always view valuation as my valuation reflecting my story for the company. It's not the story for the company and the valuation. So I finished the valuation. I posted my blog. I think I'm done. But right after I post the blog, I get emails from 4 different places asking whether they can take my blog post and run it on their site. The first was a site called 538.com. Have you heard of it? 538.com was founded by Nate Silver, used to be the New York Times pollster. He's a statistics geek. It's a fun site if you like questions, like, you know how they have a hot hand in basketball legend? They take things like that. Is there truly a hot hand? So they take urban legends and they test them with the data. So the editor of the site called me and she said, can I run this because our readers are numbers people and they'd like this. I said, be my guest. So the whole post. The second place I got a call from was the Forbes blog. Who reads the Forbes blog? Usually 75-year-olds with flip phones. I think it's a very old value investing, very different audience. And I said, yeah, go ahead. The third place that called was a site called Tech Geek. You heard Tech Geek? It's actually a technology, it's a digital magazine for Silicon Valley people, venture capitalists. They said, we'd love to run this because people here are interested. I said, go ahead. And the final call I got was from a site called the Ride Sharing Guy. It's still around. Type in Ride Sharing Guy. It's run by a guy called Harry Campbell, and he writes for Uber and Lyft drivers. There are almost a couple of million of them around, so he has a big audience. He said, can I run this because my Uber drivers would be really interested in the valuation of Uber. Same post, 4 different sites. I get 4 very different sets of feedback. On the 538 site, here's the kind of question I get. I read your post. I noticed you told us that you used the 90th percentile of your histogram, but that's 11.97% and you're using 12%. Why? And I said, why don't you take the Excel spreadsheet, take the 12%, replace it with 11.97% and see what happens. 5 minutes later, I get an email saying, I see why you did what you did. Nothing happened. So not much. It's only the second decimal point, a lot of tech geek questions, math geek questions. The Forbes blog loved it. They said, this is the way those tech people should be valuing companies. I spent no time on that site. The Tech Crunch guys, not Tech Geek, Tech Crunch guys absolutely hated it. Their response was, how dare you value one of ours with your D.C.F? We don't do that in Silicon Valley. There are like 400 comments. 250 were pure insults, most of which I didn't quite get. One said, you DCF guy. I read it and say, what does that mean? Is that good? Is that bad? But the other 150 started with an insult. You idiot. Let me tell you how surge pricing works at Uber. And this is a tech engineer who worked at Uber. He said, this is how we track people. And let's face it, I don't know those inside details. I learned from reading those comments, but to read them, I had to get past the insult. And then I got to the ride-sharing guy's side, and I learned things about Uber I would never have learned from their top management. Uber was going around telling investors that they kept 20% of the fare. That was technically, it looked like they did. So an Uber driver from LA writes to me and he says, I know Uber is telling the world that they keep 20% of the fare, but here's what's happening in LA. I used to drive for Lyft until a few weeks ago. Uber paid me $3,000 to switch. Now Lyft is offering me $5,000 to switch back. I feel like a free agent without a contract. And here's how he ended. He said, I wouldn't be surprised if all of this money being paid, they ended up with 7 or 8% of the fare, not 20%. 5 years later, that's what Uber reveals to the world. They're making 7 or 8% contribution margin in the biggest cities. And my reaction was, I knew that already. Your LA driver told me. This is the feedback loop. And it actually came to a crescendo about 2 or 3 weeks after I write this post. I was in Munich airport waiting for a connecting flight, and it's delayed. So while I'm waiting, I'm checking my email, and I see an email from a guy called Bill Gurley. For those of you who don't know Bill, he's a partner at Benchmark Capital. Benchmark Capital is a VC firm that was one of the first VC firms to invest in Uber. They invested $1 billion pricing. Bill actually was on the board of directors at Uber. Was rumored to be the person closest to Travis Kalanick, who is the CEO of Uber. Let me ask you an easy question. Does Bill Gurley know more about Uber than I do? Absolutely. I see the email, I open it, here's how it goes. He says, I read your post on Uber and I did not like it. I said, okay, we got that out of the way. He said, I've written my post to counter your post. It's blog post to blog post warfare, very 21st century. And I've said some mean things about you, and I just wanted to let you know. Sincerely, Bill. So I close the email. I've got an hour and a half for my flight. Guess where I go next? I go to Bill's blog. It's called Above the Crowd. He's 6 feet 6 inches, so above the crowd. No. And he basically took issue with every part of my story. He said, Uber is not a car service company. It's a logistics company. Notice how words have consequences? What do logistics companies do? They do car service, they do moving, they do delivery. He said, we're not just urban, we're going to be everywhere. Gave examples of how Uber planned to go to rural areas, suburban areas. And then finally he said, we're going to take our dominance of cities like New York and London, which you already have, and we're going to partner with airlines and with credit card companies. So when you fly from New York to Jakarta and United, after you make the reservation, there'll be a little box at the bottom that says, do you want an Uber car waiting for you in Jakarta? Very clever way of saying, if we dominate a city, we're going to, that local benefit, we're going to globalize. So like 6 pages, he didn't mention a single number. I read the thing. I'm fascinated by his story. Along the way, he took a few swipes at me, most of which were true. He said, this Damodaran guy has never taken an Uber. That was a lie. I'd taken one Uber ride. Right? He doesn't know the technology of ride sharing. Guilty as charged. But at the end, I'm sitting there in Munich airport. I write to Bill and I say, I read your post. It's fascinating. Would you like me to put a number on your story? He said, what are you talking about? I said, you've told a big story for Uber. I can convert to value. He said, be my guest. And here's what I did. I took my valuation and I took that total market of 100 billion, the car service market, and I tripled it, include moving and delivery, much bigger market. That 10% market share, local networking benefits, if his story is true, the world will be dominated by 2 or 3 ride-sharing companies, not 10. So I can give Uber at 40% market share. You change those numbers, what you get as a value is 53 billion for the company. I sent him the value, still sitting in Munich airport. And I said, do you like this more? He said, a lot. And he said, oh, by the way, this 20% share is not long for the world. It probably get lower. I almost told him, your LA driver told me that already. I said, that's easy to fix. Tell me what's going to be. He said, about 10%. So I made it the slice 10%. The value. You said, how can the same company be worth 6 billion, 29, or 53 billion? Depends on how the story is being framed, right? You're saying, but are they all true? They can't all be true. In hindsight, one or the other is going to be true, but you can see how stories, as they change, will affect value. Towards the end of 2014, I wrote a post, again, I milked this Uber thing as much as I could. I wrote a post in Uber where I took the Build-A-Bear concept and I applied it to valuation. Have any of you seen a Build-A-Bear store in a mall? They're creepy little places, right?
You take your 7-year-old in, they give them a piece of skin, and in the next 30 minutes, you have the ugliest looking bear on the face of the earth. And then they do a very sneaky thing. They come up to you and your 6-year-old and they say, you know what, you don't have to buy the bear, but if you do, it'll cost you $75. I can guarantee you're not leaving that store without the bear.
So I said, let's build a valuation of Uber because I got sick and tired of people bitching and moaning about what they didn't like about my story. I said, my story, my value, my money. You don't like my story, make it yours. So at each stage, I let people pick their own story. Is Uber a logistics company, a car service company, an on-demand company? Saying, what's an on-demand company? You need something done in a hurry. An on-demand company steps in. The closest I can think to a company that's an on-demand company is GoCheck, which is a Jakarta-based, it's an Indonesian company. They do moving, they do delivery. They will stand in line for an Avengers movie if you want to get a ticket, and it'll take 2 hours. So essentially, they're arbitraging the fact that you value your time a great deal more than somebody else might. And in countries like India or Indonesia, there's a huge gap between what people value their time at. It's a useful idea. So I said, does it have local networking benefits, global networking benefits, no networking benefits? So with each one, I let people pick their choices. And at the end, I say, came up with the value depending on the choices that people pick. And guess what? Depending on your story, your value can be anywhere from 800 million to 90 billion. Doesn't mean they're all viable, but they're clearly stories which are more plausible than others. But with young companies, you can see why there's divergence across stories because there's so much of the book still waiting to be written. Final component of this, you tell a story for your company. The story looks good. Can the story change? Yes. It could shift. It could even break. Let's take the story break first. You built a company. Let's say you're a company that offers homework assistance to kids. Check. Right? Check was a company that went to $2.5 billion. What did they do? They hired people, especially smart high schoolers. They paid them $30 an hour, which is a lot for a high schooler. Then they offered homework assistance. Took off. But what caused that story to break? Check is now worth close to zero. Now, if you have a question, let's say you want to know the hypotenuse theorem. You don't have to call a human being, right? You can ask ChatGPT, and ChatGPT AI has killed that company. That's a story break. You thought you had a great story until. I'll give you another example. Have you heard of this company called Ashley Madison? You're shaking your head really vigorously. What was its business model? No, it was a cheaters site. There are a lot of cheaters in the world, so they connected cheaters with other cheaters. That's what Ashley Madison's model was, and I'm trying to soft pedal this. So essentially, it was people cheating on their spouse with other people cheating on their spouses. It was a great business model. There are a lot of cheaters in the world. Do you know what caused the model to break? One day, somebody hacked their computer and got the name of every cheater in the world on the website and made it public. There were politicians on there were actors on there. Overnight, the company's value imploded for good reason. Stories can sometimes break. Hopefully, your company's story will not break in the next 2 months. But if you're a Canadian lumber company today, your story is creaking, right? It could very well break if the tariffs kick through. Stories can shift. What does that mean? Your core story stays the same, but the contours of the story vary, right? Your revenue growth could get higher, your margins could get lower. And sometimes stories can change where your company either does something you never expected it to do or doesn't do something that you thought it could pull off. Your story for your company can change, it can shift, and some of your stories might break, in which case, what will the value of your equity be by the time you get to May 5th and you turn? It'll be worth nothing. So be ready for those changes because they will come. So I'm going to start on actually, notice we were, 14, 15 sessions into this class. I haven't valued a single company in full, right? I've talked about it. So now we're actually going to start valuing companies. And I'm going to start simple. So I'll give you the setup, what I'm going to do. So I'm going to value a variety of companies. Some are going to be mature, some are going to be growth companies, some are young, some are old, some are developed, some are emerging market. But with each company, rather than go through the whole valuation, which is going to be incredibly tedious, I'm going to pick on one or two aspects in every valuation where I want you to focus and say, this is what is new about this valuation. So I'm going to tell you the story for each of these companies. I'm going to tell you why I picked the inputs that I did, how the story connects to inputs. And they're scattered over time. There are some valuations there that go back 20 years, some that go back 2 years, some are more recent. So you're going to see me change over time, the macro environment. So let's start easy, right? Let's start with companies that look a lot like bonds, mature companies that pay big dividends. They're the easiest to start. Let's start easy. The company I'm going to value is a company called Con Ed. Con Ed is the company that probably all this power we're dependent on them. It's a regulated utility. Somebody explain to me how a regulated utility in the US works. What's the process?
Provides some sort of service, so it feels the government gives them monopoly.
First, so regulated utilities, you're given a monopoly. So basically, the government says, we'll be the enforcers and we won't let competition in. And return, what does the government get? Your monopoly. You come with pricing restrictions. So Con Ed to raise prices has to go in front of a legislative committee, the New York Assembly, and tell them why they want to raise power by 5%. And you know how the regulatory committee decides whether to give them a pricing increase or not? They look at the return on equity that Con Ed makes and compare it to this is one of those places where the CAPM actually has an actual effect, because the model that you get, if it says 11%, you're making 10%, you might be allowed a price increase, but if you're making 15%, they might say no price increase. So regulated monopolies, you basically are getting the benefits of no competition, but you don't get the benefits of setting prices. So that's going to play out here. I'm going to value Con Ed with essentially a stable growth dividend discount model. Let me explain why. Remember, I said most companies, free cash flow equity is a better measure of what can be paid out. So here's what the first thing I did. I looked at how much the company was paying out in dividends. It was paying out about 73%. Those dividends basically are almost equal to the free cash flow equity. This is the rare case where a company pays out what it can afford to in dividends. So I could say with dividends. Why did I decide to use a stable growth model? What's the essence of stable growth? What should the growth rate be? Less than or equal to the risk-free rate, right? Basically a growth rate that you can sustain forever. And if you look at the return on equity and retention ratio for the company, remember that shortcut? Their expected growth rate is about 2%, well below the risk-free rate of 4.1%. So they pay out what they can afford to in dividends. They have a low growth rate. Final check I ran was, if you're a stable company, mature company, your cost of equity should be roughly where the market is. Your beta should be close to 1. And it turns out that the beta is 0.8 for regulated utilities, slightly less than 1 because they're less risky. They meet all the ingredients for a stable growth dividend discount. So I put in the expected dividends next year. $2.32 was the dividends last year, growth at 2.1%. You divide by the cost of equity. Comes from the risk-free rate, plus the bottom-up beta and risk premium, 7.7%. And the value you get per share is $42.30. You're done. You're saying, I wish I should have picked Con Ed to value for my project. You still can. The value is almost trivial, right? Dividends, cost of equity, growth rate. The stock was actually trading at $40.76. So at least based on the dividend discount model, it looks slightly undervalued. Let's say you have those two numbers and you can see where it's coming from. Expected dividends next year, cost of equity and growth rate. I'm going to ask a question which, if any of you are going to end up in equity research, it's a way of taking what you've done in this class and frame it in the language of equity research analysts. Equity research analysts love giving target prices. Target prices are what they expect a stock's price to be a year from now. In a discounted cash flow valuation, what you get is the value today. The value I'm getting today is $42.30, right, from the dividend discount model.
I gave you the cost of equity for the company, 7.7%, and I've also given you the expected dividends next year. With those three ingredients, can you convert my dividend discount model value per share today to a target price a year from now? How do I go from value per share today to expected target price a year from now? What is the cost of equity? It's what I expect to make if the stock is correctly priced, right? So in this stock, what do I expect to make? 7.7%. You take the 7.7%, you take 42.30, grow it at 7.7%. If you had no dividends, that's what the price has to be. It has to come entirely from price appreciation. But because you have dividends, you can take the dividends out. Your expected target price, and you can work it out, it's like $45, $44.50. So if you're writing an equity research report, this would be a target price. I expect the stock to be $44.50. And if you go out and buy the stock today at $40.76, going to translate into a rate of return well above 7.7% because the stock is underpriced. If a stock is fairly priced, it earns the expected return, the cost of equity. Stock is underpriced, it's going to earn more. You can go target prices 2 years from now, 3 years. You can actually pull it out as long as you want if you want to impress somebody. But basically, the fact that you get a value per share today doesn't stop you from giving target prices if that's the language you want to speak. So that's a Con Ed valuation. Do a second valuation. You know what 3M does? Lots of boring things, right? You're thinking of their high-tech products. You know what the most profitable 3M product is? Post-it note. The guy who invented that should win a Nobel Prize. Because we stick it on everything, right? In different colors. I'm a 3M investor, so I thank God for those Post-it notes every day. It's a company that makes a lot of boring things that have high margins and protected by patents so they can keep doing it. A company that's been around a long time. This is a valuation I did on September 12th of 2008 in the morning. There's a reason I'm emphasizing the date. It's a Friday. I value the company. Market is in a little bit of turmoil. The value that I got per share was $83.55. And the story I told was a fairly upbeat story, a story of a company with a brand name and these products with great margins that would continue to do what they're doing, which is reinvest a reasonable amount, but at great returns on capital because of their brand name, and end up with a growth rate of 7.5% a year. Not super high, but it's a big company in a mature business. And you fade the growth out, you come up with the value. The value is $83.55. The stock was trading at 70. 9:30 in the morning. So ask me the question. Every one of my valuations, I'm going to force you to ask me the question. If I truly believe my valuation, what should I have been doing at 9:30 in the morning right after this valuation? I should be buying the stock, right? It's significantly undervalued. I wanted to, but at other things, I'll say I'll do it on Monday. Best decision I ever made. Because what happened that weekend? That was the beginning of the 2008 crisis. Over the weekend, Lehman got into trouble. There was talk of Barclays buying it. By Monday morning, that had fallen apart. Lehman goes under. Now, for the rest of the year, you are in the crisis. So this is a pre-crisis valuation. 4 weeks later, I returned to the valuation. Things changed? Yeah. The numbers for the company itself hadn't changed yet, right? Because the financials don't get updated. But I made two big changes. One is, remember the risk premium of 4.5? It's now up to 6%. The market, this is the advantage of an implied premium. As the market is in crisis, the premium goes up. Second, the default spread in my debt, even though the rating hadn't changed, the default spread went up. So the cost of capital reflected more risk. Okay? As you know, so that goes into my cost of much higher cost of capital. On the numerator, I was still feeling my way around because the numbers hadn't got updated, but I knew that the chance of a recession had increased because of this crisis. So I reduced the growth rate from 7.5% to 5%. Still early, but I've got to make my best estimate. With those changes, the value per share I got was $61. $84, $61, right? Undervalued, still undervalued because the price dropped even more. I did buy 3M after the crisis. In fact, 2 weeks after that, stock had dropped to 52. But when you're in a crisis, don't give up. The value will change. And I hope and pray you will not have this crisis play out between now and May 6th, May 5th, because it could very well happen that you could take a company today and 2 weeks from now, 4 weeks from now, 6 weeks from now, you could be looking at a very different environment. And the first thing to start changing is the equity risk premium. Don't wait for me to update my implied premium. You have the spreadsheet, update the premium if there's been a significant change. In fact, I sent you the March 1st, 2025 implied equity risk premium. That feels like ages ago in terms of time. Put in today's S&P 500. You're going to get a higher equity risk premium. Put that in, update your valuation. It'll keep, and keep your head above water here. Don't panic. Don't kind of throw things into the dustbin saying it's a crisis, no point valuing companies. But I wanted to bring out this 3M valuation simply because it shows you what a crisis can do to your valuation, even though the numbers didn't change. Any questions?
So here's my task for you. Over the weekend, I want you to start thinking about the story for your company. Start thinking about bringing the Excel spreadsheet and make that story explicit as you value your company.
Small. No, you can use them. No, you can use them. You can definitely do it. Thanks.